Much, and thank you for being here today. I'm excited about this talk. So I have been talking to Kim and Tim for literally months because we were pushing it back until there was a little more data and a little bit more to talk about. So I'm really, really glad to finally be here and have a chance to hear about this. So let me start with a little bit more formal introduction. So Kim Castens is a special research scientist at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory of Columbia University. And Tim's name is actually Thomas Shipley, but those of us who know him call him Tim. He's a professor in the Department of Psychology at Temple University, which is kind of a really interesting mix, these two different backgrounds. So Kim's a geoscientist, and she got really interested in how people think and learn about the Earth. As long as I've known her, that's been her kind of passion and fascination. And Tim is a psychologist who's been interested in how thinking of geologists reveals their understanding in a very underappreciated capacity in the human mind, which is for all of us who are geoscientists in the room, that's a kind of a wonderful tribute. For years, they've collaborated on spatial thinking and geosciences. And then Kim started thinking about feedback loops. And she perceives that reinforcing feedback loops underlie many of the most urgent problems facing humanity. And figuring out how to balance those feedback loops underlies perhaps some of our most promising solutions. And Tim was drawn to the work on feedback loops, thinking that this powerful form of human thought that is really understudied by cognitive and learning scientists. So with that introduction, I'm going to turn it over to the two of you and look forward to hearing.
Thank you, Margie, and thank you all for coming. I'm enjoying seeing this gallery display of people from many different phases of my life, people from Lamont, people from Integrate, people from other aspects of things that I have done. So welcome. I am going to share my screen and pull up my PowerPoint, and let's see. So I believe that you are now seeing a PowerPoint called Thinking and Teaching About Feedback Loops. Is that correct?
It is.
All right, good. Why should we care about thinking and about feedback loops, teaching and thinking about feedback loops? Why care? I have been thinking back over my education, and I came to realize that the only thing that I am certain that I learned in high school that I use almost every day is typing. Hamilton Central School class of 1971 taught me to type. So I pose to you the question, what are you teaching your students that they will still be using 50 years from now? And Tim and I would like to suggest that feedback loop thinking can be a capacity that is sufficiently enduring and sufficiently broadly applicable that it may still be of use to your students 50 years from now. So before I try and support that bold claim, let me get us all on the same page as to what it is we're talking about. So feedback loops are systems in which there's an initial action that triggers a chain of influences that can either amplify or counteract the initial action. So here's a drawing that shows if there's a change in A, that causes a change in B, which could then influence some change in C. And after a while, it loops back around and nudges the original element that was moved. There are two kinds of feedback loops. Positive feedback loops act in such a way that if there's an initial nudge to A, it circles around the chain of influences, and then the final nudge back to A is in the same direction as the initial change. And the characteristic behavior of a positive feedback loop is that some important element in the system increases exponentially or decreases exponentially, such as, for example, the number of infected people in a pandemic spreading situation. The other kind of feedback loop is a negative feedback loop in which you start with a change to one element, you cycle around the chain of influences, and then the final nudge back to the initial element is in the opposite direction as the initial change. So if A changes in one direction, then you go around the circle, A changes at the end of the loop in the other direction. And the characteristic behavior of a negative feedback loop is that important elements in the system oscillate or move towards an equilibrium value over time. There's actually two sets of nomenclature out there. You'll also find the terms reinforcing and balancing feedback loop used in place of positive and negative feedback loop. Tim and I are bilingual. We use both terms somewhat interchangeably. You should adopt whatever is the norm in your department and use that with your students. Positive and negative are a little more common in environmental science. Reinforcing and balancing are more common in systems dynamics. But anyway, okay, back to this claim about why feedback loops are so important. Feedback loops are found across many content domains. An example from physiology, ecology, climate, engineering, economics, again, on and on and on. Feedback loops have very strong predictive power. So the IPCC has a lot of different climate models in it, and they all share the attribute that they are full of feedback loops. Feedback loops have strong explanatory power, especially for things that initially seem puzzling or counterintuitive. Early in the COVID pandemic, when deaths were rising and rising and rising, and it was so hard to get a handle on what was going on, Daniel Kahneman, who is a brilliant psychologist, very insightful about the ways that human thinking can go astray, was interviewed as saying, this, meaning the pandemic, is an exponential event. We're seeing things doubling every 3 days, every 4 days. And people, including me, don't seem to be able to think straight about exponential growth. I knew that there was COVID in France, and I was about to fly to France. It was beyond human comprehension. But it's not so beyond human comprehension if you think of pandemic spread as being a feedback loop, such that as the number of exposed individuals goes up, the number of sick and contagious individuals go up, which means that the number of exposed individuals go up. And every time around the loop, there's an increase and then an increase upon that and then an increase upon that. Feedback loop teaching opportunities are everywhere. So this is an article that showed up in the New York Times a few days before I first used this slide, referring to the reinforcing feedback loop of ambition, begetting more commitment, which begets more ambition. So if we draw that, it looks like this. And finally, I'll give the final word to an undergraduate, my nephew. As an undergraduate, heard I was working on feedback loops. He said, oh yeah, Kim, feedback loops, they are the superpower of environmental science. They explain so many things about that are surprising or powerful in environmental science. So our learning goals today are that your learners should be able to recognize feedback loops when they encounter them in novel situations. They should be able to deploy feedback loop thinking and anticipate behavior of growth, decay, stability in situations that they might encounter in either their personal life or their professional life. And they should be able to leverage feedback loop thinking to nudge systems that they care about towards solutions to problems. So we'll mostly be working on the first two bullets. We'll touch on the third bullet, and we will work our way through two learning strategies. The first is extract the schema, and the second is causal loop diagrams. So we would like to know more about you guys before we plunge into these two teaching strategies, then we know sort of where you're starting from. So I'm going to ask Monica to launch a poll now to so we can learn about you. And also, if you could please type into the chat if you are teaching about feedback loops, what courses you teach them in. So to what extent do you teach about feedback loops? Choose the one that's most accurate. One choice.
About 5 more seconds.
Okay, so we have a range of experiences. So we have somebody out there who is teaching about feedback loops as part of a comprehensive approach to systems dynamics, including use of computational models. So for this person, I think that what we're offering today can be a feedback loop. I mean, not a feedback loop, an on-ramp onto what you're already offering. For people who haven't thought about feedback loops at all, I hope that we will give you both the motivation and the tools with which to start. For people in the middle, this is kind of the sweet spot where I think this webinar will be well suited, and we would like to encourage you to teach about feedback loops as more of a generalizable concept, moving beyond teaching about it as just one specific bit of content. So I am now going to turn the podium over to Tim, who will tell you about the first of our two teaching strategies, extracting the schema. So I guess I have the capability to close the poll.
The first thing to do is say thanks for putting in how you've been teaching about feedback loops. We have an active research program that's just beginning to ramp up for thinking about how to support feedback loop thinking, and we can use all the input that we can get from practitioners who are actively involved in feedback loop education. Extracting the schema was described as a strategy. It's really both a thing that the mind is doing, so it's a strategy that the mind can invoke when approaching the world, but it's also the name that we are using for a teaching activity. So we are focusing on extracting feedback loop schema, that is the abstract quality of what a feedback loop is. The activity I'm going to be describing, it uses analogical alignment to identify commonalities across multiple cases. This may seem a little counterintuitive to try and teach somebody something general by showing them a couple of specific cases. But the idea is to allow them to look for the thing that is common across the cases so that the student leaves with a sense of the abstract pattern, the thing that is common across multiple cases. I'll be making the case that this may be a stronger way of educating somebody than just flat out giving them the general definition of something. So how do you know if somebody has discovered a pattern? Well, I'm going to start with some research from the cognitive science literature. And the way they know that somebody has discovered a pattern is that they're going to give them a problem that's relatively difficult to solve. This is a problem that some of you may recognize from logic books. There is a doctor who has a patient. The patient has a tumor. The tumor is otherwise inoperable. The only way to treat the tumor is to treat it with X-rays. Unfortunately, this type of tumor requires very powerful X-rays, so very strong dose of X-rays. The problem with a strong dose of X-rays is that it will damage the tissue on the way into the tumor. And so what does the doctor do? How can the doctor treat the tumor without damaging the patient's tissue? If you have encountered this before and solved this, you may remember the answer. If you have not encountered this before, you may feel, as most people do who first encounter it, this is not an easy problem to solve. And most people have trouble coming up with an immediate advice for the doctor for how to proceed. In this research, what the researchers did before giving the radiation problem was to have them read two scenarios. In the first scenario, there is a general who wants to attack a fort. He has a big army, but the people defending the fort have mined the roads. So if they try to march that big army to the fort, the mines would blow up and the army wouldn't make it there. the general comes up with a strategy. He sends small groups of his army from multiple directions in towards the fort. And each one of these small groups is not large enough to set off the mines. The participants then get a second scenario in which they read about Red Adair, who is fighting a fire at an oil well. This is a big fire, requires a lot of foam to put out the fire. The problem is that there is not a hose that is big enough to dump all of that foam on the fire all at once in order to put it out. What's the solution? Well, the solution is Red Adair positions small hoses all around the well to get a lot of foam all at once onto the well. After reading these two, people are encouraged to think about similarities about the cases. And once they have done that, they're then given the tumor problem, where where they are very likely to recognize that it bears significant similarities to the last two things that they have read. You want to get a large amount of something to a point in space. There is something that blocks that from happening. And so the solution is to have whatever it is come in from many directions at once. So what participants the outcome is that people are after they've read the two scenarios and considered how they are similar, they are particularly likely to solve the X-ray and tumor problem. So they appeared to have picked up a pattern. You can think about what they've done is that they have these multiple cases, the case of Red Adair fighting the fire, the case of the general attacking the fort. Each one of those cases can be thought of as having a tree structure where each of the elements in a tree is a piece of the case, the spatial locations, the relationships among the parts, and by aligning them appropriately, the person is able to pull out the common structure. There's something large that needs to get someplace, but it can't get there, so that large thing can be divided into multiple pieces. So the alignment, the setting up of the analogy among the multiple pieces allows people to discover the pattern that is in the two cases, and then use that pattern to figure out what to do in the problem at the end. You may be familiar with the terminology of analogical reasoning. The analogy that you are likely familiar with is X is like a Y. So one might say to somebody, oh, this unfamiliar animal is like a familiar animal. That what you are doing is you are providing something that is well understood in order to use that well understood thing to draw inferences about the thing that you don't know much about. In this case, the not well understood animal, the unfamiliar animal. The value of extracting the schema is that it allows you to enter into new domains where you don't necessarily have well understood concepts. So the idea here is that in feedback loop thinking, people may not have that base Y. That's something that they can draw from so that you could say, oh, this thing is like a feedback loop. And so we need to do something to help people come up with that underlying pattern. So how are we going to do that? We're going to do that by analogy. So we're going to give two cases, the way the researchers did, two cases of feedback loops. So the first case comes from economics. When a country's economy is growing, people have increased their spending, which leads to businesses hiring more people. The people who have been hired have more money and are spending more. we're going to give a second case to consider, in this case from earth science and climate system. When air temperature increases, more water evaporates. Water vapor is a greenhouse gas, so water vapor in the atmosphere leads to an increase in air temperature. After people read the two examples, they're encouraged to compare and think about what the examples have in common, the cases have in common. They're then to list the important parts and the relationships in each case, and then to take that list and try and pair the corresponding parts and relationships in the two scenarios. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause for 1 minute to give you a sense of what it feels like to be a student in this situation. So what I'd like you to do is, on a scrap of paper or on an Excel spreadsheet, to take the parts of each one of these very short case descriptions and the relationships in each one of these, and make a list and try and construct that list so that the parts and relationships align. All right, and then after that, there would be an opportunity for people to compare the ways in which they differ. What I'm going to do is I'm going to relatively quickly move through my doing this, where I identified the parts, and what I mean by the parts is the country, the economy, growing, people, increased spending are all parts of that first case. And so you end up with I end up with a list like this for economics: country, economy, growing, people, spending, business, hiring, and money, and another list for the earth science example. I also pull out the relationships. People have increased their spending, which leads to businesses hiring more people. So here the relationship is between a part that can vary, can increase or decrease, and another part which can increase and decrease. And the relationship tells me how those two relate, and that can be described as people spending influences business hiring. I construct a list of the relationships in economics and a corresponding list in the relationships in earth science, and then I take those two lists and set them in a way so that they are lined up, so that I can see the analogy between the two. The economy is like the climate, people spending is like air temperature, business hiring is like water evaporating. I guess I could pause at this point and say, you may have had a different list. Your list that you came up with in that very limited time I gave you may not look anything like this, and you may be itching to complain about my list. We will be wanting to hear concerns or senses of misalignment, or how this this may have gone awry, but I'm going to put that discussion off until give you an opportunity to enter it in the chat, and then we'll have some time hopefully at the end. So I'm going to use a graphical description again to give you a sense of what we think people have gotten out of this activity. So this is a causal loop diagram. Kim will be talking a little bit more about causal loop diagrams in the next part, where one can see the reinforcing loop, air temperature leading to increased evaporation. Increase in air temperature leads to increasing evaporation, leads to increasing water vapor in the atmosphere, leading to increasing air temperature. So that both of these have a common pattern that is discernible when all the pieces are lined up, and that common pattern resembles the pattern of the generic positive feedback loop that Kim had showed you at the beginning. So why we think extracting the schema is powerful, and here I'm mixing both why we think what is powerful because of what's going on in the head and why we think it's powerful as an activity for students, is that we think that it helps people focus on the essential features, that is the loop, the positive relationships among the elements. It helps them avoid being distracted or thinking that some superficial feature was actually important. So a common error that we've encountered in our own work is that people think positive feedback loops are things that have good outcomes. So they either in the example they were given or in the word that's used for the name of the loop, that this additional feature entered into the way they are thinking about feedback loops. That having extracted the essential features helps you recognize new instances of this thing. In this activity, we made the alignment explicit to help with the extraction, to help develop so that this can be developed slowly as an understanding. And there's an opportunity to do this as a group activity, so multiple minds can converge on the discovery. As I said, we are doing some research. We certainly don't have definitive data on the design here. We think, but we have a few recommendations we think are important. The first is that it's important to use different domains in the two cases. We explicitly chose a social domain and a natural science domain to avoid any possibility of there being surface similarities. When people try to align analogies with very few surface similarities, that can be challenging. So a reason for using a table, the table format, in fact, when we have done this with students, we give a pre-formatted table, is that it helps with the alignment, and the alignment is then externalized. It's not something that people have to do in their head alone. It's probably important to identify cases where there is alignment as well as when there isn't alignment. So what's the same across, what is different? We're pretty sure that you need to repeat this for negative feedback loops. So if it goes swimmingly well with positive feedback loops, that doesn't mean that everybody now understands feedback loops generally. That probably they would not be able to generalize from the positive feedback loop activity to understanding how balancing feedback loops work. How many of these different activities does one need to engage in the classroom? We are confident it's more than one. Is it more than two? This is where our confidence begins to break down. We suspect that it's more than two, but it's not a large number. So I want to close by asking you to take a minute again to think about how you might use this activity that I've described in your own course. So what I'd like you to do is to type your thoughts into the chat. You can either type it to the group or you could type it to me specifically. We're interested in hearing, particularly hearing concerns that you might have as I said, we're working on design to try and create an activity that's deployable in different types of courses. So if you see challenges, if you see things that are nice about it, that would be great to hear. If you see challenges, we'd also be interested in hearing that.
Okay, have we been a minute?
I think I ran long, so you should.
Okay.
Maybe.
Thank you very much. I can't see the chat anymore, so I don't know if people have stopped commenting. So let's see. I am going to talk about our second strategy, which is to use causal loop diagrams. Tim gave you a glimpse of causal loop diagrams and showed the power of using this kind of visualization to show the alignment or similarity between these two systems that are different on the surface of it in the climate system and the economic system. So I am going to talk about a few best practices in how to draw these diagrams, which seem kind of simple on the face of it. And then I'll talk about a couple different ways to set up active learning situations where these kinds of diagrams can help students understand about feedback loops in specific content domains or more generally. But before I go there, I want to just state that causal loop diagrams are life and professional skills. This is not just a classroom activity. So here's an example from a study that was done by a group of systems dynamicists collaborating with an NGO working on soil salinity in agricultural watersheds in developing countries. And they were using causal loop diagrams drawn on pencil and paper to gather understanding from stakeholders in developing countries, formalizing that information into feedback loop diagrams, causal loops, and then using that to build a comprehensive model of an entire complex system. We're not going to get this complicated today, but I just wanted to say that this skill set that you're offering the students at the introductory or undergraduate level can carry them far in their profession if they choose to go in this direction. So now to talk about some best practices in making these kinds of diagrams. As an example, we're going to use the familiar ice albedo feedback loop. I saw some people type that in the chat. In which a change in temperature of the atmosphere influences the temperature of the ocean, which influences the ice coverage in the Arctic, which influences the fraction of solar energy absorbed by water, which influences the ocean temperature. And every time you go around this loop, the ocean temperature gets warmer and warmer and warmer. So in helping your students learn how to make these drawings, the first component is these little text boxes, which are called nodes. And best practice is that these should be a noun or a noun phrase, some entity that can increase or decrease, because later on when these might become an actual computational model, you'll want it to be a variable that can increase or decrease. So after that, the next element is these links, the arrows. They carry the action. So sometimes they could be read as A causes B, the thing at the beginning of the arrow causes the thing at the end of the arrow. Sometimes it's not quite as strong as cause. It could just be influences or leads to or favors, all else being equal. There's two kinds of these little arrow links. When you see a positive link, a plus sign, that means that the head and the tail and the arrow are moving in the same direction. They have a direct relationship. If A goes up, then B also goes up. A moves in the same direction as B. Or sometimes you see a negative arrow, a minus arrow. That means that the thing at the beginning and the end of the arrow move in opposite directions. If A goes up, then B goes down, all else being equal. Sometimes it's useful to also specifically indicate the initial nudge. So if we're talking about isalbedo feedback loop, that you could specifically indicate the initial nudge such that if atmosphere temperature changes, ocean temperature tends to change in the same direction as shown by this plus here. And then sometimes you'll want to put in an indicator that shows the net effect of the entire loop. Was the entire loop tending to be a reinforcing loop or a balancing loop? Or if you're using the other terminology, a positive loop or a negative loop. So you could put a symbol in the middle of the loop to show the net effect of the entire loop. And I put this comment down here, medium can be anything. Causal loop diagrams work very well with pencil and paper, with markers on whiteboards. They work in any kind of drawing app that you might be familiar with. In a moment, I'm going to demonstrate doing this on the worst possible drawing app, which is the whiteboard in Zoom, but it's something we all have access to. So these are clues that you can give your students to help them build their capacity to draw these kinds of loop diagrams. And next, I'm going to talk about 3 different ways to craft assignments or learning activities that use these causal loop diagrams. Diagram to story, story to diagram, and then diagram to improvement or intervention. So diagram to story, the prompt would be basically you would give the students a causal loop diagram and ask them to turn it into a story, a narrative of what's going on in the world. So continue with our familiar albedo example. If we're teaching about the 21st century, where atmosphere is rising, we would say, okay, temperature is rising in the atmosphere. That leads to a rise in ocean temperature, which leads to a decrease in fraction of the Arctic covered by ice. So this is a negative link leading to an opposite direction change. This becomes larger, this becomes smaller. That in turn influences the fraction of incoming solar energy that's absorbed by water, again, in the direction of a minus link, which circles back and causes the ocean temperature to rise. And as you go around and around and around the loop throughout our modern era, it's a reinforcing feedback loop, and it gets warmer and warmer and warmer. You could use the same ice albedo effect to tell a different story. You could tell the story of Snowball Earth. At a time when the atmosphere was getting colder and colder and colder, the Arctic Ocean, the world's ocean got colder and colder and colder. And each time you went around the loop, the world got colder and colder and icier, and less solar energy was absorbed by the world's oceans. So that was a different story that you could tell from the same diagram. So students can do this as a written activity, they can do it as a collaborative activity, they can do it as a presentation to the class. It pulls forth aspects that they don't understand. It pulls forth weaknesses in their understanding. Next, we can do story to diagram. So you can give the students as the prompt the story, which can be a story you make up or that you pull forth from your textbook or from the media. So I'll demonstrate with a simple example from ecology or forestry, forest succession. When trees begin to grow in a previously cleared field, the trees that grow the fastest gain access to the most sunlight and thus the most energy. Using this energy, they can grow even taller and shade out competing trees. So Monica, if you could put that paragraph into the chat so people can continue to see it, even though I am going to exit out of PowerPoint, then I'm going to stop sharing, and then I'm going to share again on a whiteboard. And I am going to talk through the process of building a causal loop diagram from a narrative. So a good place to start is usually the the main elements the same way you did in the previous activity. So there was something in there about the fastest trees. So I don't want to put fast or slow. I want to put a variable that can go either up or down. So I'm going to put tree growth rate. Okay, and then there's something about accessing the most sunlight. So I'm going to put tree, come on, tree access to sunlight. Okay, then there's something about getting the most energy, So I'm going to put down here something like tree ability to photosynthesize. You have to be confident of your spelling to do this in front of people. And then the tree growth rate to tree access to sunlight, that's a pretty big leap. I want to fill in an intermediate step here. So I'm going to put in tree height relative to neighbors. So then I want to make the connection. So I'll take this arrow tool and draw some connections between these different elements. And then I would talk this through, which I'm not going to take the time to do, but I would want then to indicate, are these pluses? These are pluses. So if tree growth rate goes up, then tree height relative to neighbors will also go up. And then tree access to sunlight will go up. And then tree ability to photosynthesize will go up. And if the trees are able to photosynthesize, then tree growth rate will go up. And then finally, I might want to indicate that this is a reinforcing feedback loop. Having students develop these diagrams, again, is a strong way for them to sort of confront where is their ignorance, where are the steps in this line of reasoning that either they don't have a handle on, or maybe even the source didn't have a handle on. So this tree height relative to neighbors was not explicit in the narrative, but it needs to be filled in order to make the story come together. So I am going to get out of the whiteboard, go back to my PowerPoint, and let's see, this one right here, and tell you a little bit more about that. You are now seeing my PowerPoint, but I need to go into, okay. So that was story to diagram. So there was our paragraph, there was our picture. This is also a powerful activity if you have students find examples in the media where there are feedback loops. This reinforces the idea that feedback loops are everywhere and sharpens their eye for looking for feedback loops. In this case, I found this example because it had this phrase in here. Maybe evidence of a vicious circle of climate change. That's often an indicator that you are in the presence of a feedback loop. So having your students find feedback loops in systems that they care about, in media that they read regularly about, is a way to sharpen their capacity to think about feedback loops. And then the final form of activity that seems powerful is to think about using the causal loop diagrams to catalyze a conversation about improving a feedback loop system. Improving could mean catalyzing or accelerating a feedback loop that you think has a desirable outcome, or alternatively, it could mean disrupting a feedback loop that you think has an undesirable outcome, or it could mean discussing or engaging in discourse around a feedback loop that might be controversial. So here's an example. This is a feedback loop about fuel cell electric vehicles powered by hydrogen, which might be part of the solution to the climate crisis, but they're controversial. They have big advantages. They don't have tailpipe emissions. They are efficient and they fill up quickly. On the other hand, they have some safety issues. So you might want to have a conversation with your students about, is this a good idea? And one of the problems is that this particular feedback loop is stalled. It hasn't gotten going. So what leverage points are there to overcome the problem that there aren't very many filling stations, and therefore drivers are not confident of being able to fill up, and therefore they don't want to buy these kinds of vehicles, and therefore there aren't very many vehicles, and therefore the vendors aren't willing to install the filling stations. So what are the leverage points? One could work on the vendors. So society could establish incentives or subsidies for vendors to install filling stations, or the government could just build hydrogen filling stations, like some municipalities are building EV charge points in front of town hall and in front of the library, or could work on this point down, this lever point down here, the driver's desire to purchase hydrogen vehicles. So right now, safety issues are a disincentive for drivers to purchase hydrogen vehicles, as indicated by this negative connector. But if we could push down these safety issues, overcome the safety issues, make them smaller, then the desire to purchase hydrogen vehicles could go up. So in this case, the diagram is being used to catalyze a conversation about what are the leverage points by which we could change this feedback loop to be more like we would desire it to be. Okay, so those were our 3 suggestions about causal loop diagrams. To summarize why we think causal loop diagrams are powerful, they take the mental model out of the student's head and put it out in front of people where it's visible, it's shareable, it's savable, it's discussable. With that shared artifact, multiple students or multiple stakeholders, as in that example with the agriculturalists, can build and see and discuss and contest and modify the model. The loop structure is more visible, more obvious than it is when you're just looking at data or you're looking at a linear narrative. And the nodes and links are potential places to nudge the system. So you can catalyze a conversation or a set of thought processes about how to nudge the system. To summarize the entire webinar, we think that feedback loops are an enduring, broadly applicable way of thinking about the world that you can offer to your students no matter what you're teaching in the domain of earth and environmental sciences. And we are pretty confident that 50 years from now, people will still be grappling with problems that involve, that are underlined by feedback loops, no matter what the state of civilization is in 50 years. And we are pretty sure that they will still be using approximately the same cognitive apparatus that we have today. And so we have crafted 2 learning strategies that we think tap into strong and deep and important cognitive abilities around analogical reasoning and visualizations. So extracting the schema leverage a powerful cognitive strategy, which is analogic reasoning, while at the same time bringing forth to your students the fact that feedback loops are important in many different domains. And the other strategy, the use of causal loop diagrams, taps into the power of visualizations for making thinking visible, while at the same time building a capacity that's not just a schoolroom talent, but is a methodology that's used throughout systems dynamics and that they may be able to use throughout their career. So thank you very much, and we are happy to answer questions.
Great, thank you both so much. I would encourage people to put questions in the chat, and also, aside from questions, maybe observations as to things that you've noticed that might reinforce some of the things that both Kim and Tim were talking about. I have to say I got myself tripped up on that one model. Tim and I've been going off on the side about the different at the nodes when you're kind of break these things down. In my mind, I think about the whole loop, the whole process. And so I think of those as being negative or positive. I hadn't really been thinking about at each juncture how there might be a negative or a positive, which is interesting, right? I'm still not sure. I have to go back and look at one of your slides.
Okay, the slides will be posted, and I'm happy to talk more about that. That is one of the reasons why I gravitate towards using reinforcing and balancing for the entire loop, so that I'm then able to use plus and minus for the individual loops, the individual causal links. And I like being able to just think about A influences B. So Tim and I have talked a lot about this. In fact, we have a whole section. We're writing a book on feedback loops. There's a whole section in the books about cognitive limitations, and one of the cognitive limitations is on working memory. And so I really like to be able to extract A influences B. Let me think about A influences B. Let me think, do I actually have evidence that in the real world A influences B? Do I actually have a plausible mechanism by which A influences B? And does the mechanism actually imply that if A goes up, B goes up, or if A goes up, B goes down? So I'm really liking the ability to just pull out one little causal connection and say, is there existing in the data, in the world's data, evidence that A actually influences B in the way my mechanism says it should? Or alternatively, could I design an experiment to see how A influences B? Could I actually collect some data that would allow that little connection, that little one link, two nodes, one arrow, that I could actually explore that through an experiment? So I'm liking being able to pull out those little links one at a time.
Yeah, I
Steve
can
has a
totally
question
see it. Yeah.
which I want to answer, but I did
Please.
want to add to your point, Margie, that Kim and I have an ongoing discussion that we return to again and again, which is how many, if you really understand feedback loops, sort of how many feedback loops do you have in your head? How many schemas do you have? And one reason that I think that there's multiple schemas, even for positive feedback loops, is exactly the struggle that you're having. That in that system, temperature is going up while ice is going down, and they are both doing that in a free loop. They are both doing that geometrically. So the air temperature is doing this, and ice cover is doing that, and that's different from systems like bank interest, where everything is going, the amount in the bank and the interest are both going up geometrically, or an explosion, the amount of chemical bonds being broken and the amount of energy being released are both going up positively. Steve pointed out that there's that one could easily get oneself in a situation where students find it challenging to align the pieces. So a little bit of behind the scenes. When we run this once in, one of our colleagues ran this once in a classroom, and it went pretty well. Students seemed to understand feedback loops better after the activity. But when Kim and I looked at the activity that was actually run, we thought, oh my, this is going to be really hard to find the correspondence in this activity. And so we completely rewrote it in this tiny little short story narrative where essentially each element spatially lines up with the next one. And I have to say, I don't know whether we did it. Well, we did that for this webinar. I'm not sure it's a good thing or a bad thing to have done that. The struggle of getting pieces aligned may have been an important part of having the students engage and really come to understand. So as long as they in the end get the alignment, that may be helpful. My intuition is that the cases should be about the same level of detail. So they could be spatially very different, they could be temporally very different, but they have to have about the same level of detail. If there was massive detail in one and very little detail in the other, I could imagine students like, which piece goes with which in this thing where there's a lot of detail? So there's I would anticipate there would be a sort of iterative process where you try it once and see how it goes, and see where the failure points are for the students, and try to take those out.
Thanks, Tim. And thanks, Tim and Kim. This was a really great webinar. This
I'm
is
so glad
really,
you liked it.
I'm going to take a lot from this, so thank you.
So Maria has asked, is there any suggestion on how to grade an activity? So um, the mutual alignment activity, the extracting a schema activity, has been used in a classroom context, and our collaborator Alex put a little bit about how to code it, how to grade it. The causal loop diagrams I've used myself in teaching. How have I graded them? I will have to think more about that. We definitely need to engage in a very serious way with this question if we do actually get this grant, for which we are now in limbo, and I do have to develop these curriculum materials further. Very good question.
I'm a
Okay.
big proponent of worked examples. So I would encourage you to consider assigning this in a sequential activity, have the students engage in the alignment, and then submit the alignment, submit whatever they did, and then provide them with your alignment. And so the grading is really just participation, but what the last step of what they have to do is compare their alignment with your alignment to see where there was a breakdown. And so it's an opportunity for them to reflect on where they might have been potentially misled, so that if you do the activity again in the future, there's a chance for them to improve.
Yes, thank you. I use the activity. I kind of use the method of having them either reading a story, of listening a podcast, and then ask them to create, well, first to identify knots, and then relationships, and create a diagram. But I got so many different point of view, and this was very simple. Actually, was from a podcast about fires. I think I got that from the CERC site. Fires in Minnesota that increase the amount of smoke, and it was very, very basic, but I got so many different answers, and I really had a hard time grading them because, well, I was doing mostly for points, and I guess I should have considered just completion, no completion. But that was one of my challenge, how to grade them.
So there's a clue from some of our early research. When we first began to research feedback loops, we gave students, undergraduates, a small narrative and an example, and so it gave them a worked a definition of a feedback loop, an example of a feedback loop, and then invited them to draw more feedback loops. And a very common failure mode, which echoes a failure mode that was seen in earlier research on temporal cycles, is students' failure to close the loop. So they will make a causal chain. They'll get the idea of nodes, and they'll get the idea of arrows, and they'll get the idea that A arrow B means A leads to B or causes or tends to cause. But they do not want this to close this loop. The idea that like you could that causality could like go wrap back around. A surprising number of students were not willing to do that in our research, and also in the temporal causal cycles work of Barbara Tversky that predated our work. We think that this has to do with the idea that causality and time are very closely coupled, an idea that's very familiar to geoscientists. And since time has to keep advancing in this direction, therefore, people tend to think that causality needs to keep on advancing from the past into the present into the future, and don't want to wrap it around. So certainly an absolutely essential piece of grading these kinds of diagrams is, are they willing to close the loop, and do they have a logical step at each step? Does each step, each node link triplet have a logical mechanism behind it? they can defend. Monica, I'm not sure how late we can go. Tim is going off to get a prize, so he
No
needs to
problem.
go. But I can stay
My
longer.
My student is getting a prize.
Oh, your student's getting a prize. Okay.
Okay.
So I can stay longer if people want to stay, and we did start a little bit late here.
Show this slide real quick, and thank you very, very, very much to Kim and Tim for the presentation. It was super interesting. I hope you guys are able to join us for a future webinar. There's some links on the screen as well as in the chat with future webinars. So yeah.
Oh, I can say something more about Margie's comment. The ice albedo example that I took from, it's a figure from our book. And in the book, I didn't want to use the word albedo because it's a book for a non-specialist audience. So I reworded the whole thing so that it didn't use the word albedo. And so it's kind of like flipped from what you would normally expect it to be. Perhaps that wasn't really a great example to bring to an audience that does know the term albedo. So.
Well, no, it's fine. I just need to relook at that. I started getting myself into one of those confusing moments. So anyway, thanks, Kathy. Thanks, Tim. Thanks everybody for trying to help me solve my my crazy here. And thank you both for just really adding a lot of really interesting observations and thoughts, and really bringing a topic that I know a lot of us teach about, think about, and grapple with today, so that we could really have a moment to learn more about it. So thanks again.
Thank you so
Okay.
much.
Thank you, Margie.
Oh, bye, Bill. Thank you.
Hi, Bill, wonderful to see you.
And your feedback looks go way back to your diagram of transform faults that I remember from years ago.
I think through drawing. There's no question about it. So drawing
Yes.
helps me clarify my ideas, and it always has, going way back. So I know that that's not so true for some other
And it
people.
seems the more nodes you put in your loop, the more sophisticated your thinking gets. Instead of clouding it, it could open up a lot of thinking that
I think that it's possible to take the same system and draw it with more or fewer nodes, depending on how big a leap you're willing to accept. And sometimes it can be illuminating to say, well, how do you think the system is getting from A to B? And at that point, the student or the colleague will say, well, I was thinking that A causes, A prime, and that causes A prime prime, and then that causes B. And like forcing the issue of, are there some intermediate steps there that you have not articulated, can be a clarifying factor as well.
But one of the biggest, most embarrassing was the whole concept of supply side economics.
Oh, yes.
They didn't close that adequately. But, it became.
Yeah, we are trying to understand enough about economics to have a few good economics examples in our chapter. So this book covers feedback loops on a very, very wide range of topics. And so we clearly need some economics examples in there. But I have to say, economists make some weird assumptions. They
Can we quote you on that?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Oh, yes.
So my cousin is in finance, and I have breakfast with him every Wednesday, and I try to get him to explain enough to me about economics so that I can write a few paragraphs and draw a few causal loop diagrams about economics. So anyway, but they're good. So Monica, thank you so much for doing.
Oh, I love I'm sorry, but I just have to say I love your nephew's phrase. I just think the superpower of environmental science is awesome.
Isn't that true? It is so true. And the thing is, when you think about how useful feedback loops are in many different domains, but where do students learn them? Like, not very many people take a whole course on systems dynamics. A few colleges offer it, but not very many people take it. And so environmental science, where it is the superpower of environmental science, is a really good place to introduce it. But you can go beyond environmental science and open up thinking about a wide range of kinds of things, so that if people go into, social services, they can think about the Matthew effect of the rich get richer. And if they go into, pre-med and anatomy, they can think about anatomy and physiology and homeostasis and how the body maintains equilibrium and so forth. So anyway, well, I think that probably we should adjourn, but get back to me, Margie, if you